I'm Julie Bartholomew. I'm a craft artist and educator and professional member of Craft ACT. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Australia's First Nations people, the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and pay respect to the elders, both past and present, and through them to Australian Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. Craft ACT has asked me to host this interview with the wonderful Glenn Adamson to coincide with Design Canberra Festival, which runs from the 9th to the 29th of November. Craft ACT's members exhibition this year is titled Care, and it aligns with Design Canberra's theme of Care for 2020. Glenn Adamson is a writer and curator and works at the intersection of craft, design history and contemporary art. He has a long list of credits and is currently a senior scholar at the Yale Centre of British Art. He has previously been director of the Museum of Arts and Design New York, head of research at the V&A and curator of the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. Welcome to this interview, Glenn, and I'd like to point out that Craft ACT has asked you to write an essay exploring the relationship between craft and care and to respond to the members' exhibition. I'll start with the first question. Why is care important to craft?
Well, thank you, Julie. And in fact, I'd like to follow your lead in observing the widely observed custom in Australia and New Zealand of recognizing Indigenous inhabitants of the land. It's not something we do as often here in the United States, but we absolutely should. And I'm here in the Hudson River Valley in New York, which is, of course, previously occupied by the Iroquois and other Native American peoples, and in fact was a very important conduit for those peoples going north and south between what's now Manhattan and up the Hudson River into Canada. So I'd also like to make that acknowledgement. And hey, it's great to be with you.
And you
talking
too.
about one of my favorite subjects, care, and then my very favorite subject, craft, and thinking about them in relation to one another. I suppose this year is well, not just any year in any way, but obviously a very appropriate time to be thinking about this word, the other C word, care. Of course, right now we're thinking about that in terms of health and community well-being, but of course it also has psychological dimensions and dimensions that have to do with objects. And you know, I often do describe myself, and in your kind introduction, you described me as a curator. That word etymologically is of course derived from the ancient word for care, and we care for things in museums and other forms of collection. What does it have to do with craft? Well, the essay that I've been writing for the exhibition, I take a little bit of a maybe unexpected turn on that point, because I think most people simply believe that craft has to do with caring a great deal, and it makes sense, you know, because makers know a lot about their tools, they know a lot about materials, they hopefully know a lot about their customers, the traditions that they uphold. And so they're caring about lots of things in lots of different directions. But if you think about it, a professional craftsperson has to calibrate that degree of care very precisely. In other words, they need to know how much time to spend and how much resource to spend in terms of materials and so on, and also even outfitting their shop, so that they can actually make a living. And this isn't as true for an amateur, of course, although even an amateur has limited time to work. But certainly for a professional, you have to be very, very honed in your expenditure of your own care. And so I think of craft not so much as a model for how to just care more, as if that were some kind of solution, but rather in a much more pragmatic and I think useful way. It's a model for thinking about how much it's appropriate to care given the situation and to really approach things accordingly. So to me, it's almost like a model of good practice that can be applied to other things. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. Craft as a model for society, craft as a model for human relationships. But to me, it is very much based in that conception of care.
To our second question, is it important to build a community to nurture and sustain craft?
Yeah, so again, an easy question to answer, yes. But what do we mean? How can we unpack that phrase a little bit? In my last book, Fewer Better Things, I talked about this quite a bit. What I was interested in there was thinking about the way that objects in former times, let's say in the 18th century, tended to be very firm markers of social connections, either because you acquired them locally from someone you actually knew or family member, or because you had a very good understanding of the material reality from which that object came. So even if it was imported from another place, unless it was Chinese porcelain or something, and it was a kind of miraculous wonder that was arriving in your life, you pretty much knew what it was, and how it got to be the way that it was. And of course, now we have the opposite situation. We have the situation of these things, phones, that are filling our lives. These devices, we just don't know where they come from, and how they got to be the way they are. And so to me, one of the key things about craft is that it reforms the anchor points socially between ourselves and the people that make the world around us. So even if you're not a maker yourself, and I'm not, I think it's so important to have an understanding of the skill and experience that goes into the fabrication of things. It's what I call material intelligence, kind of faculty, and as a kind of social adhesive, you might say.
And that's the thing with new technology. So much of the processes are hidden, but with craft practice, it's all there to be discovered and to work with and to create a relationship with.
Yeah, exactly. Although it might not be wholly self-evident, because obviously if you're dealing with a very well-made thing, you might be quite perplexed as to how it was possible that somebody could have achieved it, but you'll still have some intuition that it's had that investment, and that's really the key thing.
Yeah. So this is $1 million question. How do you think craft is going to be impacted in the post-pandemic world?
Yeah. Well, curiously, I think probably the COVID-19 pandemic is just accelerating a trend that's already been underway. And by the way, there have been lots of trends that have been accelerated by the coronavirus, touchless purchasing and online teaching, et cetera. But one of them is definitely the relevance of craft. I think, and I fully expect, that people will be ever more involved in their locality, ever more aware that their own domestic environment is crucial to them, and that whether that's a matter of bringing in crafted objects from other people, or quite likely actually getting their hands on and thinking about something they can do that will provide reassurance and continuity in a period of massive disruption. It's just been a huge reminder of why craft is so important. There are also some other things that are a bit more politicized, you might say. For example, the fact that in America here, one of the many crises that we had was that there wasn't enough local production of PPE, personal protective equipment. Yeah. And so what you had were maker spaces and individual workshops actually making masks and other gear. And there was, I think, a really useful discussion there about just how problematic it is for a country to not have enough domestic production capability. And so that's another thing that you might see more investment in, even at a governmental level.
Absolutely, yes. And to our final question, the Craft ACT Members Exhibition showcases the contemporary trends in craft and design. What work stood out to you?
Well, yeah, I always hesitate to choose specific
to single
things.
out.
Yeah, exactly. So instead, maybe what I'll say is that I think what you have in the ACT exhibition, which I think is pretty common in group shows in craft, but is particularly highlighted here, is this simultaneous drawing out of tradition and also bringing out of innovation at the same time. It's a complicated dance, obviously, because whether it's a basket or a ceramic pot or a piece of glass, on the one hand, you have inherited so much and you want to honor that as a maker. On the other hand, you have your own expressive voice, and obviously you want to make a contribution. And I think, whether it's a traditional form expressed in a new palette, or a transformation from one expected material to another, or an introduction of new imagery into a conventionalized form, you see so many things in the ACT show that have that kind of combination of values of respect and creativity. And that's really what you come to craft for. You know, you don't come to it just to be reminded of what you already love. You also come to it to see things that are new. But equally, you don't just come to it for novelty. You also come to it for a kind of foundational experience of culture. And I think the show does that marvelously.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And I think that's the challenge for most craft artists, is to find that balance between the traditional languages and materials that we inherit and contemporary dialogue. Yes.
Yeah, you know, you're trained in a certain way. And so it's very natural to, for example, start by copying things. You know, I think many, particularly self-taught artisans, will begin that way. And then you gradually start to explore your own voice. But if you lose that tether to the way that you were trained, you kind of, you know, it's like the bass line and the music's gone.
Yeah, you start to float.
Exactly.
Very true in my experience as well.
Yeah.
Look, it's been a delight to talk to you today. I will let you get on with your day or your night. And thank you so much for joining us. And I'd just like to mention to all those that are watching, if you manage to get to Canberra during November, please see this outstanding exhibition at Craft ACT, or one of the many 200 events for Design Canberra Festival. Thanks, Glenn. Take care.
Great pleasure to be with you. Thanks.